Salam and welcome to our fourth Critical Thinking Skype seminar. I am Hera, the project manager at New Horizons, and we are really blessed to have our very own Dr. Shanon Shah leading this online critical thinking seminar on sexual diversity and the Ummah. Shanon is the deputy editor of the quarterly periodical Critical Muslim, the flagship publication of the Muslim Institute. He was also a multi-award winning singer, songwriter, playwright, and journalist in his native Malaysia. So Shanon sent around three pieces of stimuli really for us to have a look at. One was the BBC report on the caning of two gay men in Indonesia under Sharia law. The other was his presentation at our annual flagship event, the British Islam Conference. And the third was his notes on textual references that are often thought to refer to homosexuality in the Bible and the Quran. And Shanon, you can lead us wherever you want.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum. Before we get into the discussion, I thought I'd just introduce the reason why I have framed the discussion in the way that I have. So the backstory to this is my PhD research was on the experiences of gay Muslims. I was comparing the experiences of gay Muslims in Malaysia and Britain. And I did fieldwork in both countries and in-depth interviews with 29 people who identified as gay and Muslim, men and women. So 17 in Malaysia, 12 in Britain. Of course, a huge part of my research was how they used the resources within Islam to reconcile or make sense of being both gay and Muslim, especially when they were hearing from many different sources around them, whether within Muslim communities or outside Muslim communities, that it was practically impossible gay and Muslim. And a lot of what I was looking at was also how they thought about things like the Quran, the Hadith, Islamic jurisprudence, and so on, and how they lived out Islam in their daily lives. And so when I started presenting this kind of stuff, on one hand, there are the more academic and theoretical discussions that I have had, in different academic settings. And I think last year, beginning in the final year of my PhD, I started presenting it to Muslim charities as well. And not everyone in my audience would necessarily have been an academic, So one of these events was at the first British Islam Conference organized by New Horizons. And this was at Coventry University last year. And it was a session called Multiple Interpretations. It was me talking about multiple interpretations of sexuality and Rabia Hanan talking about multiple interpretations of hijab. So for my slot, I had 15 minutes. So I was introducing some main ideas to the audience, which was very largely Muslim. I think there were some religious scholars in the audience as well. And I was talking about, I gave examples of particular passages in the Quran, particular hadith and so on, prophetic traditions, and how these were received and interpreted by some of my participants, in light of their experiences as gay Muslims, and how they actually read the Quran in quite empowering ways, right, which embrace their full identities. And I only had 15 minutes to do this. And after that, a friend, someone whom I consider, at that point I was becoming close to him, who is not gay, he's a straight Muslim, very pious, very religious, but has been involved in the human rights scene in the UK for a while and British Muslim activism. He came up to me, he said, I really want to be an LGBT ally, and I think that I am, but as a Muslim, I just don't find this convincing. So your argument about how the text actually says it's okay to be gay and Muslim, I'm not convinced by that. So he said to him, the Quran quite clearly prohibits homosexuality and bisexuality, and so on. Right? So I thought, okay, this is interesting that he wants to be an ally, but he sees the block as the text. There's just no way to get around it. Yeah. And this reminded me of an experience that I had with, because before I did the PhD, I did a master's where I was looking at LGBT activism within the Church of England. And I interviewed an evangelical priest, right, who was also heterosexual, and who said for evangelicals, there's this idea of biblical inerrancy. There's just, you have to take the Bible literally.
Mm-hmm.
And he said for a long time, he also thought there's no way to get around this, right? What the Bible says about homosexuality is clear. Until one day, his wife was in an accident and she went into a coma. And the person who looked after him the most at that point in time was his superior, who was another gay priest. Another priest who happened to be gay, not evangelical, but an Anglican priest who happened to be gay. And he said this person basically was there for him throughout this ordeal until his wife came out of the coma, really looked after him, and was basically kind of a saintly, angelic presence in his life. And he said after that event, after that whole episode, when he went back to the Bible, he just couldn't read it in the same way anymore. The same passages that he thought were so clearly condemning homosexuality, it just didn't make sense that way anymore. And so he started to change his mind as an evangelical and became quite an open advocate of LGBT rights among evangelical Christians. And the thing about his story is I have encountered enough, not very many, but enough heterosexual Muslims and heterosexual Christians who have been on this journey. So this friend of mine who came to me after the British Islam conference and said, look, I want to be sympathetic, but I just can't because the text gets in the way. You know, I asked him, I said, is there anything that you would challenge about your previous understandings of Islam? And he said, yes. You know, we were previously taught that if someone's not Muslim, then they can't go to paradise, then they go to hell, right? Unless you accept the Shahada. He said, I don't believe in that anymore. I don't think that's what the Quran says. It's basically if you're a good person, do good, and that's basically it. I said, well, why is that? Well, because my wife is not Muslim. And he said, and my kids are really close to their grandparents, my wife's parents. So how could they possibly go to hell? So this is why I've selected the readings, and this is why I've done it in this way, because I think that the text is really important. The point about these stories is that I'm talking about people. The religious text is absolutely crucial to their experience of either Christianity or Islam. But it is shaped by the context.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so that's why I've chosen these sorts of readings. I've chosen to put some key passages for us to reflect on. But I've also chosen to talk about it from a more sociological perspective, which is, you know, I talk at the British Islam Conference, you know, the creation of how people become LGBT allies as Muslims. And I thought of looking at a real life case study as well to show that this is not just an academic discussion. These two gay men in Aceh were formed.
Thank you. That's such a good way to present what we're talking about. It's really powerful to hear those anecdotes, those stories of real people who've changed their minds, but changed their minds in a way which is meaningful to their faith and to their personal lives, and trying to be better people, not just giving up everything that they believed in, but trying to reconcile and figure out what is it that they're reading in these scriptures and the holy books that they believe in. So thanks a lot for sharing that. I just wanted to add something related to what you were talking about right now, and also in your video of your presentation, the sociological aspect of it and how much our culture, our environment, the people around us, our relationships shape the way we interpret and look at texts, religion. In psychology, my background is in psychology. There's this idea of contact theory that once you actually meet people and meet them in an equal footing, when you talk to them and you humanize them, a lot of the ideas that we have get reshaped by those interactions, by the contact, and the prejudices actually get wither away as well. So I think that's also relevant to what you're saying, how much our relationships play a part in our interpretations of our beliefs.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting you say that's one of the frames that I was drawing upon as well, because in the social sciences there is social contact theory. So exactly. Talk about that as well.
Yeah.
But the one ingredient that is very important in this kind of contact and how it changes people's minds is this person. You know, when we encounter people who are different from us, it's not just enough to get to know them, you know, and be friendly with them. It's also about, do you see them as a good person? You know, can you see them as morally good human beings? And if you can, and if they play that sort of role in your life, then your challenges will be, your prejudices will be challenged if you have to rethink how you think of them. And also in my talk at the British Islam Conference as well, a Muslim friend of mine, she didn't just meet a gay man, she met a gay atheist man who was absolutely, took care of her at a really difficult point in her life. So as a Salafi straight Muslim woman at that point, she had to rethink not just her thoughts about homosexuality, but about atheism as well.
Yeah, exactly. You're right. I mean, that's the crucial ingredient as well, because when I read the BBC, it was BBC report, right, on the Aceh caning, just looking at these pictures, it was actually really disturbing. I was, to be honest, pretty disturbed. I had heard about it before, but I was trying to avoid not reading too much about it. And when I read it, it was really disturbing. But the picture, I'm sure you've seen, both of you, where there's a crowd and some people are smiling, and it seems as if they're deriving some pleasure. So just seeing somebody is not enough. Just some sort of contact or knowing somebody is not enough. Like you said, it's very important to have an idea that, okay, these people are not only human beings, but also you empathize with them as deserving of dignity. Otherwise, if you see them as sinners, then you're not necessarily going to have a lot of respect for them.
Yeah, and Shannon, that was actually one of the things that I was going to put towards you. So I saw your presentation at the first British Islam conference and the video in the second one, and I think you do always. And I think you're right in that if people have close friends or who are gay or don't identify in this sort of male-female binary, it's easier for them to empathize with them. But I think the problem we have is that most Muslims probably won't have those encounters with people. And so it then becomes an issue of how people are interpreting the text and also who's educating them and where are they also getting their interpretation and education from. In your notes, I found that quite interesting about looking at, how we've inherited this Judeo-Christo understanding of the story of Lot. Is there a problem with saying that's the Christian version of events, but Islam is its own path, when so often in the Quran and Muslims themselves feel so connected to the Christian path?
Maybe the three of us can actually look at the texts now and reflect on them and just discuss our reactions. I thought of maybe starting with the Quranic passages, reading them out loud, reflecting on them, hearing them, and then I'll read the passage from Genesis so that we can all think about how we are reacting to these words. So the first is from Surah Ash-Shu'ara. The translation for this portion is, the people of Lot denied the messengers when their brother Lot said to them, will you not fear Allah? Indeed, I am to you a trustworthy messenger. So fear Allah and obey me. And I do not ask you for it any payment. My payment is only from the Lord of the worlds. Do you approach males among the worlds and leave what your Lord has created for you, mates? But you are a people transgressing. They said, if you do not desist, O Lot, you will surely be of those evicted. He said, indeed, I am toward your deed of those who detest it. My Lord, save me and my family from the consequence of it. So he saved him and his family, all except an old woman among those who remained behind. Then we destroyed the others, and we rained upon them a rain of stones. And evil was the rain of those who were born. Indeed, and that is a sign, but most of them were not to be. And indeed, your Lord, he is the exalted in might. Okay. I'll read the passage from Genesis, chapter 19 of Genesis, and it's much longer. So the two angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gateway of Sodom. When Lot saw them, he rose to meet them, and bowed down with his face to the ground. He said, please, my lords, turn aside to your servant's house, spend the night and wash your feet. Then you can rise early and go on your way. They said, no, we will spend the night in the square. But he urged them strongly, so they turned aside to him and entered his house, and he made them a feast, baked unleavened bread, and they ate. But before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people, to the last man, I repeat, to the last man, surrounded the house, and they called to Lot, where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us, so that we may know them. Lot went out to the door to the men, shut the door after him, and said, I beg you, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. Look, I have 2 daughters who have not known a man. Let me bring them out to you, and do to them as you please. Only do nothing to these men, for they have come under the shelter of my roof. But they replied, stand back. And they said, this fellow came here as an alien, and he would play the judge. Now we will deal worse with you than with them. And they pressed hard against the man. Lot came near the door to break it down. But the men inside reached out their hands and brought Lot into the house with them and shut the door. And they struck with blindness the men who were at the door of the house, both small and great, so that they were unable to find the door. Then the men said to Lot, have you anyone else here, sons-in-laws, sons, daughters, or anyone you have in the city? Bring them out of the place. For we are about to destroy this place, because the outcry against his people has become great before the Lord, and the Lord has sent us to destroy it. So Lot went out and said to his sons-in-law who were married to his daughters, up, get out of this place, for the Lord is about to destroy the city. But he seemed to his sons-in-law to be jesting. And the morning dawned, the angels urged Lot, saying, get up, take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, or else you will be consumed in the punishment of the city. But he lingered. So the men seized him and his wife and his 2 daughters by the hand, the Lord being merciful to them, and they brought him out and left him outside the city. And they brought them outside. They said, flee for your life. Do not look back or stop anywhere in the plain. Flee to the hills, or else you will be consumed. And Lot said to them, oh no, my lords, your servant has found favor with you, and you have shown me great kindness in saving my life. But I cannot flee to the hills, for fear the disaster will overtake me and I die. Look, that city is near enough to flee to, and it is a little one. Let me escape there. Is it not a little one? My life will be saved. I think I'll stop there for now. There is a bit at the end where his wife looks back and she becomes a pillar of salt. So, I think these are very long passages, and I think now we react to it. So, any thoughts?
Yeah, I have a couple of observations. So the first thing that I was noticing is that there's a really big difference in terms of the detail in the Quran versus the passage, what was it, Genesis 19? There's a lot of detail in Genesis 19, which is not there in the 2 verses that you highlighted earlier, Surah Ash-Shu'ara and Surah Al-Hijr. And the other thing that I was noticing is that in the Genesis version, there is a lot more focus on what I'm interpreting it as rape or threat of rape or threatening to hurt the angels or the guests. While in the version that we were reading, the Quranic surah, I don't see that as the highlighted part, the highlighted sin. I see, for instance, the first line is the people of Lot denied the messengers. And it seems that that's the focus. And also the second last line of that surah, but most of them were not to be believers. So it seems as if there's much more focus on disobedience, lack of belief, getting the message, but still being disobedient. So do you think, do you notice that kind of difference as well?
Yeah.
I think maybe I'm biased, but the thing that always really gets me about the sort of biblical version is how he offers up his virgin daughters instead of the guess. And that always bothers me, as if, I don't really know why that would be any better. Like the rape of your daughters would be any better than the rape of your guests.
On this, the Surah Al-Hijr, they mentioned something which is similar, where Prophet Lot offers his daughter again to the crowd. But in that verse, the way it's actually written, it seems to be for lawful marriage instead of like do whatever you want. But like you're saying, I don't know how much what difference that makes in terms of just changing the name or making it legal to the welfare of the daughters, and whether they would suffer less if it's a legal marriage versus not. So, yeah, but there does seem to be that difference in those two verses.
Yeah. But similarities?
I think the similarities are that, Lot is the hero, the good guy. I guess the mentality of the people that is somehow in error. And again, in the Quran about them being disbelievers, and in sort of the biblical version with his wife turning into a sort of a pillar of salt, and people coming and ransacking the house, etc. It's sort of Lot's the one who's doing right and is on God's side. And I think there's something gone terribly wrong with the town itself.
The other similarity that I've noticed is that in both of these, in the Quran as well as in the biblical version, the wife is mentioned pretty clearly that except her, the family was saved, but not the wife. And from what I've read, I cannot understand why. I understand that she was saved initially in the biblical version because she was brought out of the city, and everything was going according to plan until she looked behind.
Yeah.
And is that her sin? So I'm not really sure what the symbolic or literal meaning of singling out the wife is in both in the Quran as well as in the biblical version.
Yeah. And I mean, I have to say that I agree with both of you. Those are the issues that you've mentioned have been my issues with these verses as well. Like, how is offering your two daughters any better?
Yeah.
Why is the wife punished? What did she do? If this is really about homosexuality, why is the wife singled out?
Or the children of the city. I mean, the whole city was destroyed, right?
Yeah.
So what about the children?
Yeah, absolutely. And, your comment, Fahad, about the level of detail between the Quran, less detail, I think all of that I agree with. For me, it's always been that I've looked at it as the Quran is probably speaking to an audience that has prior knowledge of the story already. So that's why it's so episodic, and it appears in different surahs. Sometimes it's just two verses that remember the people of God, they did this, and so on. Sometimes you get the longer passages, and then you go back to the Bible and there's the full story. However, in the Hebrew scriptures, the cities are named, right? Sodom is named. But in the Quran, the cities are not even named.
Yeah.
So, and I've heard arguments from people who say that therefore they can't be the same story. But to me, they are the same story. There is something here that's happening that's interesting. Do you know what happens after this episode in Genesis 19?
Prophet Lot and his daughters, I believe, they go to the cave, I believe. So I might be wrong because I read this a while ago. And then the daughters kind of misled him by intoxicating him, and then they had intercourse and they got pregnant, both of the daughters. Is that what you were asking?
Yeah. So
God.
basically, what?
I did not know that.
Didn't you?
No.
Okay, so, and it's actually in the Bible, because you've seen this passage in chapter 19, Genesis.
Yeah.
There's a lot of detail that comes after that as well. They realize that the lineage is going to end because the whole cities are destroyed. There's no one anymore. And one daughter says to the next, well, how will we ensure that the lineage continues, right? And the first daughter says to the next one, look, we need to get father drunk. We need to get Lot drunk. And so they feed him a lot of wine. And the first daughter says, So when he's drunk, I will go to him first, and then when I'm done with him, then you go to him, right? And this is how we will procreate, and we will ensure that the lineage continues. So there is drunkenness and incest.
Wow.
I know, that was my reaction the first time I heard about it.
When I first was coming to terms with it, because I'd only known what the Quran said before that, and a friend of mine who was Christian in Malaysia, this was way before I did my PhD or anything, she was like, let's look at Genesis. So I looked at Genesis. My first reaction to it was, wow, I'm glad I don't have to deal with that.
Yeah.
So, and my biases are showing now. I thought I like the brevity and the ambiguity, because that gives me a lot more to work with. I have a lot more questions. And I felt the biblical text was a bit more difficult. However, I did something similar to this at a church once, a very liberal Anglican church in central London. And I asked the people, so my audience was mostly liberal LGBT Anglicans. And I asked them to compare the biblical passage and the Quranic passage. And one of them said to me at the end that the Quranic passages are so much more problematic. The Bible is so much easier to handle.
There is more detail, so interpreting with more detail leaves less room for ambiguity, and it's very clear, some of those passages, what's happening in Genesis. Or did she say something about how it's less problematic in Genesis?
She said in Genesis it's so clear that this is a problem of rape. She didn't mention anything about the two doctors. She didn't mention anything about the wife. I think that sort of didn't figure in her interpretation. So I think what happened with this liberal Anglican woman is that being Christian was very primary to her identity.
Mm-hmm.
And she had found so much else within the Christian tradition, because she was, I suppose, juxtaposing it with stories from the Gospels. What would Jesus do?
Right.
And there's no record of Jesus ever. There are no stories in the Gospel about Jesus saying anything unkind. There's no mention of anything we could interpret as homosexuality in the Gospels.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so she reads everything else based on that. So the amount of detail in Genesis doesn't bother her. And this is my theory, right? But then as a Muslim, for me being confronted with the Bible for the first time, I was like, wow, the amount of detail in here is quite disturbing.
She does seem to have a point if when I'm rereading some of the passages. So Surah Ash-Shuara, for instance, in the story in Genesis, it does seem to come across as rape, as a threat to rape at least. Mm-hmm. But in the Surah, if I read it, it says, "Do you approach males among the worlds and leave what your Lord has created for you as mates?" So that is cannot be clearly interpreted as rape, right? It could be interpreted as infidelity, though, because it's both of those things are together. Do you approach males, but it's not only focused on the gender, because immediately it says, "and leave what your Lord has created for you as mates." So it's already assuming that there are mates, that these are heterosexual people, or there are mates already assigned, but these people are not, they're cheating on them, or they're not being faithful towards them. That's my interpretation, at least.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not necessarily about rape, right? This surah doesn't clearly lend itself to that interpretation.
Yeah. But what is interesting, I think, within the Islamic tradition, I completely agree with you there as well, is, in our tafsir tradition, the tafsirs of these passages in the Quran, there have been disagreements, right? Ibn Hazm, the Zahiri jurist,
yes,
was very much more inclined to say this is not just about sex between men. There is an element of violence here. There's an element of public disorder here and coercion. And so there was a package of sins, basically, that they were being punished for. And to Ibn Hazm, then, therefore, if it's just sex between two men, it cannot possibly be this serious if it is just a question of sex. There has to be an element of public disorder as well.
Mm-hmm.
No, I was just saying, just this verse, what you're saying, that interpretation, how did they reach that interpretation? Was it based on other verses? Because this this surah doesn't really talk about public, for instance, violence or a threat to violence. This specific one, it's just basically saying, do you approach a man and leave your mates? It seems more about infidelity and nothing about rape or coercion or violence.
Yeah, I think in some of the other verses they talk about them being criminals, having created wickedness, and in the Textual tradition, this is elaborated. So the theme of highway robbery. I struggle to come up with a coherent 100, and I'm being honest here. I struggle to come up with a coherent 100% satisfactory reading of these verses. But I also know that if we look at the caning of the two gay men in Aceh, I personally can't see how one has led to the other.
Yeah.
Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. I was just wondering what your thoughts were.
In your video, you put, I think it was Tariq Ramadan, although he's not fully on board, but he does believe in gay rights and transgender rights. I thought interestingly you labelled him as an ally. It's sort of, I would have thought that was the basic, everyone deserves these human rights. You don't have a right to go around caning people because you don't agree with the way they live. I thought, and I don't know, I guess it was just sort of a shock that, wow, we're really in that state where someone like Tariq Ramadan, with just such a base level of, people have rights that we can't transgress against. And that's an ally?
Depending on what his context is, he might be an ally. But, there are so many unknowns with him. Would he say this in a Muslim-majority country? So there's a Saudi alim called Salman al-Oda, who I think last year at some point said, gay Muslims are still Muslim. They should not be killed. It is a sin, it is a public disorder. This is a guy in Saudi Arabia, Salman al-Oda. And he's been getting a lot of flack for that. Because to say that within a Saudi context is huge.
Right, yeah.
Or Rashid Ghanouchi, the founder and head of the Ennahda party in Tunisia, says homosexuality should not be a state crime. This is the Tunisian equivalent of the Muslim Brotherhood.
Mm-hmm.
He's saying that. So, by the standards of someone, say, like Amina Wadud, that doesn't go far enough. But for the context where they are, I think that's an interesting discussion to have. So Tariq Ramadan, for me, even in my presentation, there was a question mark.
Yeah.
Because I think it's quite easy to say what he says in Europe to a group of Western Muslims.
And even the sort of the categorization of sort of gay Muslims as like they're not Muslim. I don't know how we got to that level either, when it's not really, it's not going against any of the articles of faith, as in, you need to, the 5 pillars or the 7 articles of faith, it doesn't go against any of those. So whether you could give a sort of a brief overview of how that happened or why we're in the position we're in, where people are now sort of saying, the fact that people aren't just saying, oh, this is a sin and we don't agree with it, but the fact that you're not Muslim because you're gay.
Well, in my experience, and this was, a lot of this happened after the Orlando shooting last year. There was a huge debate because a lot of Muslim leaders did condemn the shooting. So after the Orlando massacre last year, there were lots of Muslim leaders, I think, came out and said, this is wrong. People shouldn't take the law into their own hands. So it's a sin. Even if you think it's a sin to be gay, it's not your right to do that. This person has to appear before. I think the discomfort was where I think the media started talking to gay Muslims and gay Muslim activists. And there were some, imams. In the UK, there was this guy called Asad Zaman who appeared on Radio 4 who said, look, it's okay if you're gay and Muslim. You're still a Muslim. You just have to still believe that it's a sin and that you need to repent, right? And you need to stop doing this. If you think it's okay to be gay, then you stop being Muslim.
Is that a fairly new argument, or has this always, as in, where did that argument, how old is this argument, I suppose? Just
from what I know, there has always been this kind of restriction on the definition of liwat. right? Among, which is, loosely translated as sodomy. But a lot of medieval Muslim jurists would really take great pains to limit the interpretation of liwat, the definition of it. It had to be penetrative anal sex. If it's just kissing, if it's just affectionate relationships, these did not count as liwat, and they were not as punishable. They might have been, transgressions, but they were not punishable by the state. And for liwat to be punished by the state, it had to be through a voluntary confession. So someone needed to have committed it and gone to a judge and said, this is what I've done, I need to be punished. So there would be all these safeguards as well. But the general consensus was that it's wrong and you shouldn't do it.
The consensus was specifically on the act, as I understand, right? But recently, our discussion often in our contemporary era is also about identities that are very modern in some ways. By that, I don't mean that they haven't existed before. The drives have always existed, the desires have always existed, and the orientation has always existed. But the way we talk about it is in terms of identity as well. And I think a lot of the jurisprudence does not factor that, because it came in a time when there was no specifically social identity called gay in any identifiable way. So if we don't actually look into that, then we sort of mistranslate all of these laws as well. They were dealing with certain other types of contexts, and not specifically with what we understand specifically right now as gay, lesbian, LGBT. So I think there is that big aspect which we have to factor in as well.
Yeah, and I think that that's an argument that definitely has been made. I'm also thinking, though, that if there are particular acts that one engages in because of one's disposition, the act will always imply an identity. If you identify as a woman and your actions are to dress in a certain way and walk in a certain way, the act will imply the identity. And it's when you transgress that, when you sort of go against the mold, that it becomes a problem. Okay?
Yeah.
So this is what I'm struggling with also. And I don't really have the answers at the moment, because I'm a sociologist, I'm an ethnographer, my research was all in the here and now. How do we actually go back in time and have a time capsule and see how things actually were in 7th century Arabia? I have no way to confirm this. Whether people actually had a label for their identities. Not because there are people who argue that they did, but the label homosexuality, that's a modern coinage, that's Western, that's a 19th century Western invention. And it comes with, now in the world now, it comes with other demands as well, demands for equality, equal marriage and so on. And I think that's where the difficulty is, because it's a difference between being able to claim your rights or just being tolerated. Yeah. And I think where the discussion is with Islamic jurisprudence is like, it's tolerated, and we make it really difficult for people to get convicted for liwat and so on. But we're not about to recognize it as okay. Tolerate these people. And I think for a long time that worked. It sounds like it worked, because I think a lot of Victorian travelers, or European travelers, even before the Victorian times, the Muslim world was shocked at what they would see as, something that's tantamount to sodomy, that would have been persecuted in Europe, but that would have been tolerated.
To your earlier question about what happened in Indonesia, the Aceh province, how does our reading what we read in the Quran or even the Bible, how does that lead to something like that? Because it does seem like a jump. But if we scroll down the paper that you sent us with the different hadiths as well, one of the hadiths that you've actually mentioned says, narrated Abdullah ibn Abbas, the Prophet ﷺ said, if you find anyone doing as Lot's people did, kill the one who does it and the one to whom it is done. Now, if those kind of hadiths are there and people believe them, as well, I can see how that jump is made, because we're talking about cleaning, right? And this hadith is talking about killing. So in a way, what happened in Aceh is milder, for lack of a better word.
Well, there's two things to say about that. The first thing I think is that hadith is actually discredited. Even some Salafi alims, ulama, have discredited it because the chain of narration is weak. One of the people who narrated that, Ikrimah, one of the transmitters, was a factionalist. He was allied to the Khawarij, and he was a partisan. And so that sort of makes it a bit dubious. Okay? So that's one thing that can be said about that hadith. And I think it says something about where the discourse is at now, that, it's still so current. It's still in circulation. And the second thing to say is to hold it to the standards of the Quran.
Yeah.
So what does the Quran say? So I think the last verse that I included in the pack was from Surah Al-Hujurat, chapter 49, verse 12. O you who have believed, avoid much negative assumption. Indeed, some assumption is sin. And do not spy or backbite each other. Right? Do not spy or backbite each other. And the reason why the two men in Aceh were caught is not because they voluntarily confessed that they were gay and they had sex with each other. They were spied on by vigilantes, and their homes were invaded, and they were dragged out. And this is a kind of public humiliation that results from an invasion of privacy.
Yes.
Which I think the Quran, from the verse that I read anyway. So again, it's not like I'm saying that's how the Quran needs to be read. It's like, from my lens as well as a progressive Muslim, that's how I would read it. I would read that Quranic injunction as, well, you can't do this. And no matter what you think of someone, you can't spy on them.
I have a question though. I was wondering why you included the hadith on do not spy, or the surah on do not spy or backbite, 49:12. In this context, is it because of what happened in Aceh province? Specifically in that context, it makes sense. But in the context of, let's say, homosexuality overall, or adult, consensual, and out same-sex relationships, this would not necessarily apply if people are out, right? Nobody needs to spy on an out couple for people to know that they are a same-sex couple. Does that mean that it's still, if there is no spying, if there's no backbiting, then it's okay to punish them?
But I would also say that even then, it could still apply, because because a couple is if the injunction is against a very specific act, no one's in anyone's bedroom to look at an act going on. Do you see what I mean?
And I included that verse because that was the kind of kernel of the Quran that a lot of my Malaysian participants were talking about. The Gay Muslims I met in Malaysia, and it's all about context. Because in Malaysia, you do have an Islamic bureaucracy. You do have these religious enforcers, the way you do in Saudi Arabia, basically, go around spying on people. And the reason why people get arrested, and it's not just gay Muslims, it's heterosexual Muslims as well, who might not be married, who go out on dates, People do report them to the religious enforcers, and they come to those homes and they break down the door, or they harass these couples. So that verse becomes very important in that context. It was a way for the progressives in Malaysia to kind of out-Islamize the Islamic authorities, because the Islamic authorities were telling them, the so-called Sharia authorities were saying, we have to police you and we have to punish you because this is what the religion says, what you're doing is wrong. And their defense was, but spying is also wrong. So what you are doing is not Islamic either.
And it's one of those safeguards as well, as we've seen often in the Quran and Sharia as well. There are a lot of safeguards against the really tough punishments. There seem to be also a lot of hedging and betting, saying, okay, but also do not spy, also do not assume anything which could be considered negative. Also, you need witnesses. Also, it's better to forgive. So there are a lot of, I think, safeguards against that kind of vigilante moral policing that we've seen, especially in a lot of different Muslim countries, unfortunately.
Yeah. And a lot of my Malaysian gay participants actually would have said to me that they did feel it was wrong to be gay, but they thought it was their business. It's not the state's business. So these were the bits of the Quran that really, really spoke to them, right? Whereas my gay Muslim participants in the UK, for them it was the diversity verses, and I've included some of them here as well. For example, one from Surah Al-Rum, the Byzantines, and of his signs is the creation of the heavens and earth, and the diversity of your languages and your colors. And they took that to mean it's just a general endorsement of diversity, and that became so much more important to them in this context.
Yeah.
Whereas in the Malaysian context, not so much. Yeah, great if it's there, but it was the safeguards, the safeguarding verses.
Makes sense. There was also another verse that I'm trying to find it. Okay, so this is Surah Shura, the Council, 4950. And to Allah belongs the dominion of the heavens and the earth. He creates what He wills. He gives to whom he wills female children, and He gives to whom He wills males, or He makes them both males and females. So that really is quite surprising. I hadn't actually read that before, and I thought this was pretty clear in its almost. It's talking about diversity in gender. It's in a very clear way. Not necessarily sexuality, but that's debatable if we interpret it in a more broader sense. But definitely, at least in a very clear sense, about not only there being men and women, but also other genders. So when it's written, or Allah makes them both male, female, that's very clearly about not just men and women, right? Non-binary.
Yeah, and I think that's a reading that a few transgender Muslims I've met, very strongly endorse.
So, isn't it? It seems to me that there is only one reading here possible, in the sense that it's talking about different genders. Men, you can have female children, you can have male children, or you can have children who are non-binary. But I'm wondering if there are other interpretations which don't interpret it like that.
I really have no answer to that because I don't know myself. But, it's something to park. It's something to look at.
Well, we've come to an hour, and I know it flies by when we're having fun. I just thought, Shannon, I'd give you the opportunity to round off, maybe with what you think the future is of Muslims, and accepting the sexual diversity within the Ummah. And do you believe that the UK is sort of the cutting edge? And is the Muslim world going to catch up, or what direction do you think we're gonna go in?
Lots of predictions.
Yeah. What do you think?
First of all, just to answer the last question first, I don't think there's anywhere that's the cutting edge. I think in every Muslim context, there are people who are questioning, received authority on Islam. So from Indonesia, the biggest Muslim country in the world, who, as I said before, Saudi Arabia and Tunisia, and the UK and the US, there are Muslims who are engaging very seriously with the text, but are not accepting received wisdom anymore. And I think the reason why I wanted to frame it in this way is that in the past, they would have been seen as legitimate. Like, these are not legitimate texts. But I personally think that there's more than one way to engage. So even the medieval, the classical readings of the text from 1,000 years ago, the reading of scripture is always mediated by experience. And I think it is a fiction to say that, there is a correct interpretation of the Quranic text that is unsullied by human experience or, the way we have been formed by our surroundings. That's just not right.
Yeah.
What I struggle with is how do we agree on an authentic reading, on a single authentic reading of the Quran? Because that's just not my belief. I think the Quran is a guide to social justice. It's a guide to, helping us connect with the divine. And it's tough. The reason why I wanted to do this session as well is because it would help me figure out, all my research has been so empirical. It's been talking about how people live out Islam in their lives, but it's so difficult to connect that with the source text, what the text actually means in the first place.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And we've only scratched the surface. I don't know where this goes from here, and I was hoping that both of you might have the last word as well.
I think that is the reason you're probably struggling with it, is because I think that's the key. I think it is coming up with more, nuanced readings of the Quran. Like even the verse which I think Fahad just picked out on, I also read that. And I don't know how many times I've read the Quran, but clearly not reading it and stopping and looking at that verse and going, oh, is this talking about, non-binary people? I mean, I think a lot of the time we do just sort of read things so with our own bias that you don't notice it until somebody who clearly somewhere was reading the Quran and saying, oh, this speaks to my truth, this speaks to me, and this is how I read it. So I know it's hard work, Shannon, but it's great work. It makes it worth it.
And I guess from what you're saying, that's helping me actually, because maybe one way forward is when every one of us reads the Quran, if we're serious about it and we're serious about the relationship with it, whether one is an alim or a mufassir or whoever, an ordinary Muslim just reading the translation, I think as long as we remain honest about our biases, what we bring to how it's colored by our own prejudices. I think when we're honest about that, then we can come up with a better reading, we can come up with a better understanding, and we'll be able to talk to each other much more nicely as well.
Yeah.
So, as long as and if we label ourselves as well, I'm quite comfortable saying now, I read it from a progressive perspective.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that should trump a conservative reading of the Quran, but at least if we're honest about it, and we come with a spirit of having a conversation together.
Mm-hmm.
I think this was really a useful session for me as well, because just reading the scriptures, discussing it with other people in a critical way, I think is so fundamental to having faith in the first place, rather than just being told something and not thinking about it. I think faith requires critical ability and really thinking about how does this apply to my life and what does this mean to me. So thanks for doing this. Thanks for having these sessions. And thanks, Shannon, for leading this session.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you both.
Thank you for your time, guys. Have a great evening.